Good afternoon to all. Thank you for joining us in this session 24. We'll discuss the digital world technology and the topic of our meeting in discussing technology as a remedy or poison. We do have a discussion now which is taking place on the freedom in the digital world, a complicated equation. We've just seen it in the last few months. We've experienced that in the last few months. So just before introducing the guest, I will give the floor without further ado to Valérie MIGNON, with whom I will co-facilitate the discussion. My name is the discussion. I'm a journalist at Libération. I will co-animate this discussion with Valérie MIGNON, member of the Cercle des économistes. She's a professor in Nanterre. She teaches economy, and she will introduce the debate, digital freedom in the digital world, a complicated equation. Thank you, Christophe. Good afternoon. Welcome to this session. Freedom and digital and freedom, based on the law of in computers and freedom. You know, this should be put to the service of every citizen, so it should be inclusive while guaranteeing the respect of freedom and liberty. And so, in fact, what are the facts? When in France, digital exclusion concerns 30% of the population. So therefore, 14 million French citizens do not have access to the digital system or face problems using it. So we can see it. You know, digital fracture is present. Now, we consider this reality. You know, digital inclusion is a real challenge for society, reduction of fracture in inequalities, an increase in chances for success, a gain in terms of autonomy, and consequently a means to preserve freedom. And anyway, this decision is crucial. I mean, for example, is digital clearly an element of freedom? And what freedom are we talking about? Now, I would say the digital and the internet could be seen as a guarantee for the freedom of expression, freedom of speech. Yet, at the same time, several people feel somewhat deprived of their own liberty or freedom because of massive intrusion and now almost systematic intrusion in our private lives through data collection, which concern us. Now, digital traces that we individuals leave around when we connect ourselves will lead to the production of at least as many data which be usable by several individuals, you know, advertisers, companies, bankers, as well as everything that has to do with crooks and other bandits. So the most direct illustration is expressed by the intrusive advertising which are invading our screens for products in line with so-called traces we've left on the web. Several examples of abusive use of data, personal data, can be provided, such as the fact that the personal data from users were stolen by Facebook in October 2018. So therefore, there is the issue of data protection and our digital identity, so that freedom would be, our liberty would be preserved. Another question arises, and which is that of the freedom of workers with the implementation of digital tools which make it possible for employers to monitor or do surveillance of their employees. This is leads us to question the limitations to be set to digital monitoring or surveillance so that individual freedom should not be violated. Now, another aspect which is quite crucial, it is that of the freedom of speech or freedom of expression. How can we guarantee this freedom while controlling it or limiting it in the case of abuse or excess? This question is very strong because the digital world has an international dimension which therefore places international law, creates new problematics for international law. Is there an increase of limitations to the freedom of speech, caused by the development of digital? The frequency and the scope of censorship, did they increase? Several countries, following like China, for example, have set up systems that will block access to some websites, for example, but not without using a control, without the control from the judiciary. So the freedom of speech, the scope of the freedom of speech could be limited because of this. So we need to find a balance between respect of the freedom of speech or freedom of expression, which is the basis of any democracy, and its legal framework. Now, next to individual freedom or liberty, there is the notion of collective freedom, which is at stake. The most striking example in that domain is probably that of the Cambridge Analytica situation. We talked about it. It was very active during the Trump election campaign, the last U.S. election, by basically getting data and private information from tens of millions of internet users. And this piracy made it possible to target voters based on the preferences of the users. The same company, as you know, is also suspected to have played a key role in the Brexit referendum in 2016, so by somewhat orienting the votes for the pro-Brexit. So as we can see, in addition to individual freedom, there is the collective freedom which is at stake, which is damaged because the campaign done through this piracy of private data is likely it could influence votes and the final result that will be imposed to the population as a whole. So as we can see, the relationship between digital and freedom is quite complex, and it comprises several aspects, dimensions, that will be discussed today with, I'm sure, fascinating speeches and proposals. Thank you, Valérie Mignon, for this introduction to a topic which is quite broad, the problem of freedom, the freedom and the digital world and in the digital world. So it's a complex or complicated equation. Now, to enlighten you on this topic and discuss so we've invited several specialists from different walks of life, different activities and jobs. Let me introduce them rapidly before I give them the floor. We have with us Joelle Toledano. She's a member of the Cercle des économistes. She is economy teacher at the Paris Dauphine University. She teaches governance and regulation, and she has a deep experience in the domain of telco and digital regulation experience because she sits at the board of the National Frequency Agency. She was a member of the l'ARCEP College, which is the telecom supervising authority in France, and they will organize in September the bid for the 5G, the new mobile ultra-fast, mobile phone system. Might be, talk about digital freedom. And you are also member of the board of administration of several startups specialized in blockchain. And you are also a specialist. You wrote a book and a report for France Strategy on the stakes of blockchain. And just to tell you that Joelle is really at the core of our topic, she will publish in September at the Odile Jacob Publishing House a book, GAFA, let's get power back. GAFA will certainly be discussed here. Then, before giving the floor, Joelle, let me introduce the other speakers. So, Alexandre CADAIN from Anima. You created a startup called Anima, which is an innovation studio and which, by developing innovation technologies, you explained that, makes it possible to organize platforms, reflections, and to develop topics such as recently, I think it was a platform, AI commerce managed by the United Nations. And around what we call the common economy, and see how artificial intelligence could be part of the common good. And you are economy teacher. You work in HEC, the business school, Economic Futures, which is not on financial. It deals with financial products associated with new technology, but about the future of the economy around this notion of common goods. And you also act at the École Normale Supérieure. I think you're a former student there. When your time comes, I'll just say a quick word at the time of transition about the topic. And then, live from Washington, Mr. Barry LYNN with us from the Open Market Institute. You're the founder and in charge of the Open Market Institute, therefore, which is, you're a former journalist. You worked in the New American Foundation. And the purpose of this Open Market Institute is quite clear. That is to fight against all forms of monopoles that are growing today in the economy, those very large corporations, especially in the digital world, such as the GAFAMs, and which now have a huge power. It's like, the supranational or supra-state power, and they are still growing and showing that they have a business model quite resilient, especially even during the COVID crisis. And they seem even stronger today than they were before the beginning of the health crisis. And the Open Market Institute is proposing alternatives for regulation and to try to limit this concentration of powers and monopoles, which is in fact inherent in our market economy, and to limit this power and to regulate the power of the super-monopoly of the internet. Now, let's start now rapidly by giving the floor to our three speakers for 10 minutes. Then we'll have a dialogue, and then there will be questions. I invite all those who are listening to us or watching us to ask questions on the Rencontre Économique Deck platform so that we can pass them on to our guests. And with no further ado, I shall leave the floor to Joelle Toledano, who will tell us that digital is a complicated equation with freedom, but not just with freedom, I do believe. So for us who are just entering this digital century, what I want to say is that digital and freedom is a complicated equation. We've just had a brilliant demonstration, but digital and competition, it is also a complicated equation. We will discuss it, I'm sure, later on, and we are few here to want to talk about this. Mrs. Vestager used to talk about it yesterday, and she said we have to ensure there will be an evolution of the competition law for digital. So, you know, okay, everything is complicated, basically. Digital is complicated, in fact. The digital world is complicated with the fact that we tend sometimes to have initially simple ideas, but often they're misleading, they're wrong. So the digital world and its various applications, I will summarize by saying it's complicated, but in fact, it is the evaluation, the assessment of the impacts and the way we manage them, which are difficult to assess, and to manage through the effects and the short-term impact and the long-term impacts and effects. In fact, what it seems to me that it is very difficult for us to anticipate on those long-term dynamics. Often we see them through our prism of the end of the 20th century and with the institution of the 20th century. And of course, 20th century is not that far away. And you remember at the end of 20th century, for some of us who are around the table, well, at the time of the creation of the internet, it was a world where geeks and libertarian were together or even merged. And on the web, well, institutions of the physical world were banned for a civilization of a spirit more human and fairer. And I'm quoting here part of the discourse of the Cyberspace Independence Declaration in 1996, the one we call the father of the last utopia of the 20th century, John Perry Barlow. Fundamentally, when we look, we take the text of the first decades of the millennium, we're not at the end of the 20th century, 21st century yet, but we're past the end. Well, we see discourses where auto-regulation to the benefit of freedom and innovation was the alpha omega of all discourses, all speeches. Today, digital economy and digital technologies are monopolized by a few players away from this horizontal cross-cutting vision, which was the dream of the end of the 20th century, with large new digital empires, American mostly, which have taken power. For us Europeans, well, our markets have been basically colonized. GAFA created sort of, you know, their own markets, captive market, their own system, outside of which is very difficult to grow, and inside which, indeed, initially there are possibilities for growth, rapid growth. There are several examples thereof. You know, it's great to be able to rely on marketplace of Amazon to start existing. It's great to, fantastic to have an app that will succeed on Apple Store. You know, we all know examples of this kind, but after a while, we realized that the counterpart is a private regulation of the from the players, and initially it is quite willing, well, as a good intentions, but now it has somewhat drifted. So those powers are economic, financial, technological, and political, mediatic, have actually completely locked competition in Europe, locked that competition through several methods, you know, talent and quality of services of all series of things we'll appreciate, you know, but also, you know, abuse of power and merger and acquisition that would prevent innovation from growing next door. From the historic dream of the space and freedom, now, well, there is Wikipedia and free software and open software, and I hope all the applications that my neighbor will place in the new common goods, but we don't have that many, or not many more than what I've mentioned, but we still often live in this dream that they're very present, and lots of speech around that discourse. Of course, we hear more other players who exist, the Chinese, the other Americans, but basically, on the one hand, we can think that often they have the same ambitions as just mentioned, and moreover, their presence in Europe, and I'm talking here about the Chinese or the other Americans, is still limited or limited to identified activities, which what really makes the GAFA so specific is the creation of ecosystems with a growing footprint. It's like a oil stain spread, and the way to control the competition. And in the last few years, there have been several technical reports, economic reports, which showed clearly, which shared this diagnostic and which showed the consequences thereof. The problem
is that quite often those institutions that date back to the 20th century are actually outdated. So, well, you might argue that this is a bit simplistic, but this is food for thought, so as to try and get together to try and understand better what's happening, so as to devise solutions. I think it's possible. I think we have to build those new rules and those new institutions. And really, in this new digital world, we have to learn how to combine short-term and long-term and to factor in economic specificities and in the digital economy. So let me give you a few illustrations and examples. I'd like to come back to a discussion we've had in France quite recently. In early 2020, the French Data Protection Agency published recommendations that explained rules derived from GDPR about cookies. You know, cookies, those small files that come into play every time you surf the web. So the point is to try and help us protect our personal data. So that seems all well and good. And that text has been partially endorsed by the State Council. But the European Commission has just acknowledged the fact that there's a real problem with the enforcement of GDPR. And you know that GDPR was supposed to be the weapon that Europe could use to defend itself against GAFAM. Well, that sword seemed to be a bit blunt now, because that system derived from GDPR is a smart system that should be effective, that is sort of the reasoning that, well, it's the concept of the country of origin. But the problem with this, even though there could be a consultation with others and everything could be fine, but our American friends looked at this with interest. But they did what we call regulatory shopping. So they chose the countries in which regulatory authorities pleased them the most, and they all went to Ireland. So I exaggerate a bit. So all the big tech that are into data manufacturing went to Ireland. They didn't go only for tax reasons. No, not only. So what followed is that when our French Data Protection Agency applies rules on cookies, which is a tiny part, more efficiently and faster than the rules that should apply generically to these big techs, rules that were actually presented as of the presentation of GDPR, we find ourselves in a situation where this advertising market that is already very concentrated. There was a little bit of competition on 15% of the market because 85% are trusted by Google and Facebook. So there were tiny crumbs left that could be shared amongst the others. So we apply the rules on those 15%, and we end up strengthening the already very strong players. So we find ourselves in a case where we meant well, but in the current state of affairs, I'm not so sure that strengthening the GAFAM strengthens our freedom. That's the first example. But that regulatory shopping, we've seen it for when it comes to tax systems. Or they went to Amsterdam so as to free themselves from certain production constraints. But that's not the only matter. You know, when we tend to think that before building defensive strategies, we should look into things. Well, there's the matter of blockchains and cryptocurrencies. After a period during which France and Europe took very defensive positions, in France, we've moved forward on a number of subjects, and we had to stop building defensive lines because they could be bypassed, and we had to set up more sophisticated systems. But another example I could give you, and it's just been demonstrated to us in vivo with the American elections, the question of fake news and hateful messages. I'm skeptical when it comes to all forms of regulations that only tackle content. Because why would you ask me? Well, because as an economist, when you look at markets that are platforms, if you don't include the whole economic model, you won't tackle the root cause. The economic model that are behind these systems are economic models that aim at maximizing advertising. And to maximize advertising, your objective is to keep people on the platforms as long as possible. So if you don't look at the economic model and the dynamics that's at play, and that advertising market that everybody admits is a black box, is opaque, I think that until we do that, we won't be able to tackle the problem with content. We have to look at the economic models that are underlying. And I have to admit that the report that was just made public on the 1st of July in the US that is tackling actually regulation when it comes to Google and other major players. So we really have to channel all our energy to try and have a really fine understanding of all those digital mechanisms. And it's only if we do that that we'll be able to build the rules of the 21st century that will strengthen our freedom. Thank you very much, Joelle Toledano. I'm now going to give the floor to Alexandre CADAIN, who I think will pick up on this kind of seminal moment where a certain utopia of the internet with that Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace in 1996 by John Perry Barlow. Alexandre CADAIN, you have the floor. You can share your vision of that complex equation. How can we reconcile freedom and digital technology? We thought it was actually it would come naturally, but we soon realized that digital technology was not only a factor making for more freedom. Well, thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here and to be able to contribute. So what I try to do is to try and look at the collective imagination that is behind and yet another gap between regulation and digital technology. So to start, I'd like to come back to John Perry Barlow and what his proposal was. And starting from his texts, try to determine where we were at, where we stand, and how we can solve that sort of dilemma. So he's the founder of Digital Economic Forum, and in 1996, I quote, "The governments of the industrial world, I come from cyberspace, the new home for the mind. I ask that you that come from the past leave us alone. You're not welcome." And a bit further on, "I only speak with the authority that freedom bestows on me." We are creating a world where anybody, anywhere can express their belief without any concern for conformity. So what I think we can read through this description of a new free world pitted against the old closed industrial world that echoes what we've been through with open source and free software, and but I think there's even a stronger echo with the collective imagination that emerged in cyberpunk and science fiction, where some authors imagined a new imagination, a new world that actually was created in science fiction 25 years before Barlow. So we might think at first that digital technology might free us from the contingency of the physical world and the borders of the physical world, as if we were in for a sort of renaissance, and that we would have at the tip of our fingers a digital renaissance where tools for creation and sharing these tools and information would be accessible to all. And as we know, and as we've been reminded, the internet and digital technology is not accessible to all. So I think we were fortunate enough to experience that we could communicate remotely with our relatives and our dear ones, as well as work from home thanks to digital technology. So that was like a dream that made us ubiquitous, and that promise, that dream, was sort of sped up by another dream, which is the one fueled by AI, that would free us from other constraints and contingencies, free us from some kind of inhuman work, so that we would merge with a sort of hybrid world. This sounds like a dream described by many authors, and we could almost argue that that type of freedom is not real freedom. It's sort of encoded freedom, akin to what gamers could experience, thinking they're free when it's really a programmer that came up with all the coding behind the video game. And quite often it amounts to encoding ourselves, humans, and guiding us. And something I always find very funny, you know, the algorithms that recommend a lot of things to us on platforms we shall not name. You bought this book, other people who bought this book bought that other book. And over the last 5 years, we're told, you liked this book, you will love that book. And these digital platforms, together with Amazon Books, are in the physical world with the same system, promising that we shall love something because we are sort of determined to love it. So as if our pleasure could be determined. You know, it's like a cognitive bubble, as if we found ourselves on social networks always with the same people, with the same circle. So To put it in a nutshell, it's as if everything were reversed, as if us humans were sort of multiplying our impulses, and the digital technology would become the matrix, as in the film, a sort of octopus sucking ourselves, a sort of digital renaissance that could turn into a new dark time. James Bryden, an artist I love, that predicts a new dark age in which data booming would not be synonymous with more intelligence because information would become too complex to enter it. So we would have to be content with short, simplistic narratives. So cyberspace would promise, in that case, dangerously to separate ourselves from the first world. And one last quote by Barlow: "Our world is everywhere and nowhere. It has no material reality with no physical constraints." And that, to me, it is the biggest peril for our times, which is to consider that the cyberspace, if it still exists, could be a refuge, sheltering us from the real world and from complex problems, a sort of science fiction Westworld, like the series, without any consequences in the first world, the real world. But the problem for me is that it's all wrong, and servers actually are not water resistant. We would only live in one world, a sort of distorted mirror, and that we would find ourselves always in the same place. Which begs the question, how can we think the digital world not as a crazy dream, but as an opportunity to reconnect with the complexity of the first world, the only world we have, so that it is just a detour, but not a running away from our world. And if I try to pick up on what Barlow said and loop the loop, there's an interdependency. Our freedom is never more than a link. We depend on one another, and maybe there are 3 levels on which we can consider that a statement. How we could better share the opportunity of a hybrid space between digital and virtual. Some said that the future is already here, but it's badly distributed, so we need to find a way to better share it. There's an intrinsic interdependency that's been built by default, thanks to all the data that we give away. So that's the objective of our initiative with iComment. With the iCommons initiative, what we've striven to do is an initiative to try and open up resources through a license system that would make it possible to manage in common what we consider to be common good, AI. And to wrap up on this point, I think this 3rd degree of interdependency should be between humans and machines, but also their natural ecosystems, nature, living species. And there's one last image that I want to share with you, a performance by Rocio Beringer, an artist that I love. She imagined a G5 that would be an interspace meeting, and so as to reconcile the rules of the world that we find time to build with the earth that has borne us. So, which begs the question for me that when the cold promise of the immortality of a machine, we should remember that we're only so free as we exist. Thank you very much.
Thank you for this presentation with a lot of references and quotes, which indeed sets the question of the internet imaginary in the networks in which we live today. And this is has been somewhat damaged vis-à-vis or if we consider the promises it held initially. Now, Barry Lynn, I will now give the floor. Give you the floor. So we've been with us. You're with us from Washington. As I said, you pay attention to the notion of monopoly and the way in the current economic system, as Joelle Toledano said, there is a prism. And we could therefore ask you the question, is this a danger? Is this a danger for democracy, for freedom of speech? And how do you see this debate today on the other side of the Atlantic? You have the floor, sir.
Well, thank you very much for having me today. It's a great honor to be taking part in this conference once again. It's and actually a happy Independence Day. It's our two nations from the first have been so closely tied together in this fight for liberty. July 4th is a very good day for this particular discussion. In my statement, I'm not going to focus so much on the sort of access to the internet, but rather on the power of the online applications that control access to the internet. Through this frame, what I can say is that, looking through this particular frame, today we face the gravest threat to our democracy and liberty. If you're European, it's the gravest threat since the war. If you're American, it's since the Civil War. Today, we also face the greatest opportunity to make a more fair, a more open, a more sustainable society and world that we perhaps have ever faced before. So what makes this moment so dangerous? The answer is simple. The monopoly power, the unrestrained monopoly power of Google, Facebook, and Amazon. It's not merely their size that makes these corporations such a threat. Two things especially make these corporations so dangerous. First, it's their control over the gate to the market. If you want to sell something or say something or see something or learn something, you can't really do so without riding their rails. Second, is they have a license to discriminate, to treat each and every seller and buyer differently, to charge each and every seller a different price, and to provide that person with different services, different information. The masters of these corporations have built what are in essence manipulation machines designed to warp and direct your decisions as to where to go, what to buy, what to watch, what to read, how to vote, even how to think. We see this political danger that these manipulation machines pose. We see it most clearly when we look at the role they play in the spread of misinformation. This was mentioned earlier. After all, their business model is really nothing more than to rent out their manipulation machines to whoever will pay them in the form of advertising. That could be Unilever, or it could be Vladimir Putin. We also see this danger in the crushing of news and trustworthy information. As we now understand, in essence, Google and Facebook make their money. And last year they made more than $200 billion in revenue. They made this money by diverting advertising dollars away from traditional advertising venues. This includes publishers and broadcasters of news. And I'm speaking here not only of old-fashioned publishers, but also online native publishers and broadcasters. Google and Amazon and Facebook divert all those billions of dollars into their own pockets. And the cost is thousands upon thousands of fewer journalists and editors walking our streets, walking our markets, walking the halls of government. This is especially dangerous at this time with COVID, with the COVID crisis. But there's something more here that is at play. The political danger also comes from the ability of these corporations to manipulate commerce itself, to manipulate speech itself. The fact that these three corporations stand in between the seller and the buyer and are free to use their intimate knowledge of the seller and their intimate knowledge of the buyer, along with their license to open and close the gate to the market according to no rule other than their own whim, also gives these corporations the ability to extort from even the largest of sellers, the largest of publishers, both money and voice. Fear of retribution in the form of being cut off from the market means these corporations get to charge powerful sellers, powerful publishers, whatever they can pay. And they get to tell these sellers and these speakers what not to say, and sometimes even what to say. What we see increasingly is nothing less than a pyramiding of power, as the oligarchs of the last generation become the errand boys of today's market masters, Google, Facebook, and Amazon. Last year, Americans learned that many large U.S. corporations censor their speech in corporations out of fear of retribution by the Chinese government. This includes Disney, it includes Apple, it includes Marriott, and Nike. To protect their access to the Chinese market, these corporations willingly repeat Chinese state propaganda. They alter the maps of East Asia. They suppress certain news and information. They promote Chinese political aims to the U.S. government in Washington and to every European government. The same is true also for the corporations that fear Google, Facebook, and Amazon. For the same reasons that some powerful corporations toe Beijing's line, many more corporations, including many of the most influential publishers of news and books, increasingly toe Silicon Valley's line. So what are we to do? 10 years ago at Open Markets, we set out to resurrect the great antitrust act of the United States, the Sherman Act. Our aim was simple. We wanted people to see that we face concentrations of economic power that are dangerous to our democracy. We wanted people to see that we have weapons big enough to break any of these private powers. Today, here in America, the people do see that power and they are terrified. But far more important, the people are also standing up to fight this power. Maybe they're not doing it through the Trump administration in Washington, but they're doing it through their state governments. They're doing it through all these other means. They're standing up to fight this power. But the time has come to move to stage 2 of this work, and that requires all of us around the world, to resurrect the ideas enshrined in a law that was passed 3 years before the Sherman Act. This was the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887, and that law was designed to take away entirely from the railroads, from the telegraph companies, any ability to discriminate in how they treat any seller or any buyer, any speaker or any listener. Over the course of the 20th century, the United States and all true democracies used the principles clarified in that law to neutralize every other essential networked intermediary technology, the telephone, electricity, broadcast, the internet itself. Our challenge today is the same. It is to neutralize Google, Facebook, and Amazon by taking away from them entirely any ability to discriminate in how they treat any seller or any buyer, any speaker or any listener. Senator Sherman, who was one of the great heroes of emancipation in the United States, one of the great heroes of the Civil War, he understood this well. He said, "It is the right of every person to work, labor, and produce in any lawful vocation, and to transport their production on equal terms and conditions and under like circumstances. This," he said, "is industrial liberty. It lies at the foundation of the equality of all rights and all privileges." Today, again, our most important challenge out of the many challenges that we face is to use common carrier-style law and regulation to ensure that Google, Facebook, Amazon, and all essential intermediaries devote their resources to actually serving the seller and buyer rather than extorting and manipulating the seller and buyer. Every seller, every speaker today must be at liberty to transport their production and to send their ideas, to share their ideas on equal terms and conditions and under like circumstances. The lesson of America's Declaration of Independence and then the laws passed after the Civil War is simple. All concentration of private power is a threat to liberty and democracy. Hence, our anti-monopoly laws and regulations are the key to liberty. They are a key to democracy. So I mentioned at the beginning that we also have this opportunity. This is a moment of opportunity. So what is this opportunity other than simply to preserve and protect our liberty, other than simply to protect our democracy? This opportunity is nothing less than to build a more just, a more equal, a more truly sustainable global community. By opening the door to the sort of radical bottom-up innovation necessary for the technological transformations we need to unleash today if we are to have a world worth living in tomorrow. A couple of times, the name of my friend John Perry Barlow has been mentioned. His vision is not alive today on the internet. His vision can be achieved if we stand up, when we stand up, to deal with these giant, terrifying monopolies. If we continue, and standing up to them means taking away their fundamental powers, if we continue to believe that modest fines matter, if we continue to think that modest taxes matter, when we're dealing with the most powerful corporations in human history, we will all fail, and the political and physical consequences will be dire. But if we fully embrace this task, if we reshape the business models of these corporations, if we reshape the structures of these corporations and the larger political economy to serve our democracy and to promote our liberty, a brand new future opens before all of us. Thank you.
Merci, merci Barry-Lynn. Merci pour.
Thank you, Mr. Lynn, for your intervention. We've covered several topics around this topic of freedom and digital world, and something that, in a way, is turning into a nightmare, some of nightmare, or a true problem of having digital world and freedom and democracy. And anyway, to restart the discussion, I'd like to put a question to Joelle Toledano. Now, you said early on that the important is to know well the digital ecosystems, to know how they function, and to see how, in a way, we could regulate them better and understand the long-term impact of the digital world. It's difficult because it's a new domain. Now, I wanted to ask you, basically, what we see today with the European Commission, with Margaret Vestager, with the number of decisions made by the Competition Council in France. Well, still, I mean, you know, there are some major corporations which keep an amazing power and which, as Barry-Lynn said, are in monopolistic situation. But today, don't we have the beginning of a response and the various actions, companies, and through the open commissions and the different penalties which have been imposed the last month? And aren't we today gone into a new period where we're trying to regulate and to understand the effects? And you want me to be brief? Yes. Okay. So we're just starting.
Alors, on est devant une contradiction.
Well, we're faced with a contradiction because I would say that in a way we have to be fast because we can't lag behind anymore. But on the other hand, those mechanisms take time. A public consultation has been launched by the European Commission with a number of options, and visibly there's a choice that hasn't been made I'll be brief and maybe a bit technical, and you can ask me questions. Choose between regulation and competition. There are proposals from changing competition law that seem pretty important. And on the other hand, we have proposals for regulation. And my personal view is, from experience, that the situation is such, as LYNN explained, is that competition law has been demonstrated not to be enough to get market situation to evolve. There have been fines, but these fines have still not been validated by the European Court of Justice. So it has not been set in stone yet, and it's very long. Technology is a lot faster than that. It's the same as mosquitoes on the back of an elephant. You know, economists would say there's a small tax to be paid to be able to make use of these monopolies. So it's a bit like Robin Hood, you know, so it's all very nice, but until competition law competition commission actually condemned Google, but you know, so we are making progress, but we have to change our methodology. The point of regulation is to be adjusted, it's to be adapted, is that it can impose constraints, but it can then evolve. We've learned from experiences that the first opening up of telecoms has not worked. It's when broadband appeared that competition could really take place, is that competitors could come up with sustainable economic models. So we're going in the right direction, but we need to go as fast as possible, but with the consent of our citizens. That is essential, because we can see it. Every time Google's been condemned, they've found remedies that made it possible for them to get their competitors to pay. That's great, isn't it? When the solution is to get your competitors to pay to win a place at your site. So since we have players that provide services that our citizens want, we'll have to be careful so that the terms and conditions of regulation do not lead to our citizens saying, well, you've deprived us of services we need. So we'll have to find ways that are legitimate, that preserve freedom and preserve a certain number of things. And not too slowly find solutions, modify, adapt them, so that, because what's the big strength of these players is that they spend all their time testing things. When you look, Google search, so Google search engine changes 1,000 times per year. So we're in a world that changes constantly, and we are too static. So we have to prove able to test remedies to get the system to evolve, to find how we can inject more competition, how we can make it so that we can come out of that monopolization of markets. And as LYNN said, we are faced with gatekeepers that bar entrance. We have to find ways. Is it through interoperability? No, well, yes, many thanks. Unfortunately, we don't have much time. We have to save a couple of minutes for questions. Alexandre. Maybe you can explain your ethos, which is that of the commons. So the internet considered as a common good, AI considered as a common good. we see clearly that each platform, each GAFA has its own AI, and they're not ready, they're not prepared to share it as a common good that would be shared with others. So really, in a nutshell, because I'd like to give the floor to LYNN and then take a few questions that we got from our listeners. How could we make internet a common? Well, with the work that we do with e-commons, we contribute, each and every one of us with our data, to that progress. So that it should be an information commons, a common good that would be maintained by a community of people that contribute to it. So more practically speaking, each and every citizen should be able to get back the ownership of our data and to know what category of data is managed by what category of service. The Decode project by the city of Barcelona is about giving back power over the data to the citizens about geolocation, for example, and then make it possible to either use that service for free or get back control over the data, but there would be a fee. And we, our idea is to give food for more reflection. And what we're working at is a system of licensing that would make it possible for each and every one of us to know where the data they've contributed are being used and make it possible that they can re-employ it to a better use. LYNN, maybe a quick word, but very briefly, please, because we have a few questions we want to take from our listeners. You've actually, depicted a fairly dark picture. Would you say that regulation, as Joelle Toledano said, internet regulation in the US of the big tech, is it making progress or not?
It is a dark picture. It's a huge problem. But as I mentioned, people are waking up to this problem at a very rapid rate. And we have the Congress, we have regulators, we have enforcement agencies. One of the things that makes me most encouraged in my 20 years of focusing on the dangers posed by monopolies is that this last year, 51 states attorneys generals, including from the District of Columbia and from Puerto Rico, have opened an investigation of Google. 49 states attorneys general. These are the from the state governments. They came together and they opened an investigation of Facebook. This is unprecedented in America. This is true democracy at work. It's the people rising up through their state legislatures, through their state houses, through their state governments, and saying, the government in Washington may not be working. The government in Washington may be failed. The government in Washington may be captured by bad people. But we're going to take on these powers using our local governments, and we're going to win. So it's a bleak time, but it's also a remarkably hopeful time.
Très bien. Merci.
Thank you. So there are procedures against Google and Facebook that are ongoing, indeed. So let me give you a few questions, because we have only 6 minutes left, and we have to wrap up on time. There's a question about, this sovereignty over information and personal data. Could the solution lie into the possibility of getting European players to emerge? Because there's been a lot of talk about a European Google, European champions in digital technology, and we can see that it is not simple. We also have a question about the emergence of Chinese, BATX, So are we moving closer to a sort of giga confrontation between these big players that are present all around the world and Chinese players that up until now were mostly present in China but are starting to develop elsewhere? And I'm thinking of an app such as TikTok that is meeting with an incredible success, including in the US. And we also have a question on the American big brother of data that through the GAFA is actually depriving us of our freedom. And we also have a Chinese version of a general censor of the internet. So the underlying question is, could there be a European way? Same as GDPR had been an attempt. So what can Europe do? We only have 4 minutes to tackle this. Well, is there a concept of freedom or that is different in Europe, or a well, a few elements very quickly. When we talk of data, it's not only about personal data. There's the whole question of industrial data. That's a major challenge. And we have a few assets in Europe when it comes to corporate data and industrial data. Secondly, it's very hard to cause a European champion to emerge. The first step is to inject competition so that we do not have big players that impose things on us and decide of the law in our instead of our states. And then, if some European players could emerge, that'd be a good thing. Yes, Chinese are going to be everywhere, but on this subject we're talking about, it's really the GAFA that are at the helm. So we have to be careful with that sort of, fear-mongering around the Chinese. I think the Chinese will do the same as those who have preceded them. Our problem is to stop our market from being auctioned off to different players with a lot of power in their hands. This is what I could say very briefly. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Alexandre. Well, my spontaneous reaction to what you're describing with that model of non-liberty on the one hand and in China and monopoly of America, I think there should be a third way. My belief is that value will only be created if we tackle the real challenges of our time, and the environment is, to my mind, a priority. And tackling these challenges could give us added value on a topic which is new. I lament that we still are stuck talking about a European Google. That would amount to trying to fight a battle 25 years too late. They have devised Google X to invent the new Google. And they have the obligation to do everything but a search engine. So we're trying to build a future by copying and pasting a past that is declining. I have confidence in European know-how. And concretely, if you were able to make the most of that know-how with a strategy of the commons, I'm sure that a European path could be devised. Thank you very much. LYNN, you'll have the last word, and you have a minute.
Discussion. Europe has, the European people have an amazing amount of power through their governments, and it's really just a matter of learning how to use it. And And this is beginning to happen, and it's what the European people need to do is really force their law enforcers to enforce the law, to break these corporations up. And Margaret Vestager, until recently, said that it was not the job of the European Union to do that. 2 weeks ago, she said, yes, maybe we need to do that. That is a movement forward, but the Europeans people need to push Margaret Vestager and all the other law enforcers to go faster and harder against the monopolies. You have the power, use it.
Merci.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Barry Lynn. Thank you to all our speakers. Many thanks to Valérie Mignon. And there you have it. See you very soon for other discussions on digital technology.